Hello and welcome to this video, and on this video I'm going to be asking if this album here is the greatest live jazz rock album, right? And the answer to the question is no, it isn't. This represents everything that's awful about jazz rock and jazz fusion, right? This is a live album, double live album created by GRP to showcase their, well, what shall we say, Fusaki stars that they had on the label in the 80s. Side 1 and 2, the first disc, has got Dave Grusin on it, Lee Ritner. It's got Tom Scott, Diane Shaw, and it's an incredible band on here with also Vinnie Colaiuta on drums, Tin Landers on bass, and Barnaby Finch on keyboards. And it is a very well produced, well recorded document of some pretty lame, middle of the road jazz fusion. The second disc, however, features the Chick Corea Electric Band. When the Chick Corea Electric Band came out in the 80s, it was a return to jazz rock fusion for Chick Corea. The first album's an absolute classic, but it was ruined a little bit by the 80s production where you felt that everything had been overdubbed and dialed in. So I bought this album here. Well, I've got to be honest, partly because it had Vinnie Colaiuta, and at that time I was buying any album with Vinnie Colaiuta on, but also for the second disc, which is basically a live album of the Chick Corea Electric Band, and that's pretty good. And you know, they do play, and there's some actual solos, you know, on there that have been played, you know, where they're soloing at the same time as the drummer is playing, so there's actual interplay and all that type of thing. No, I don't think that is the greatest jazz rock live album of all time. But I'm going to put forward one that I think could well be. And the reason is because I think it's very underrated, and I wanted to give it some love. So that's what I'm about to do on this video. This video has been motivated by the great Sean Toner, who is a contributor to Sea of Tranquility, but also a jazz rock and prog guitarist. And he put this album on Facebook up against Between Nothingness and Eternity by the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Now, my gut feeling is that album is perhaps the greatest live jazz rock album. The Mahavishnu Orchestra being the greatest jazz rock band of all time. And their third album, which is an absolutely essential classic, was recorded live. So although it doesn't represent the Mahavishnu Orchestra in a live context playing the studio tracks, what we have is all new material on that album. That album has been since released with an extra disc, which actually features the Mahavishnu Orchestra beautifully recorded, playing tracks from their previous two albums, and it's an absolute classic. I think if that disc had originally been on the Mahavishnu Between Nothingness and Eternity album, and I think if it had been mixed better, because the original mix was not great, but the remix or remastering that they've done is absolutely fantastic. That could well also warrant as being the greatest jazz rock album of all time. But the album he put up against it is an album that even I don't talk about that much, and it's an absolutely truly great album. So this morning, motivated by what Sean had said, I decided to put this album on again, and it absolutely blew me away. It was so fiery, it's beautifully recorded, and I started to think this could well be my favourite live jazz rock album. Now, why does it matter? You know, why does it matter, you know, to try and work out a great live jazz rock album? Well, for me, the whole thing about jazz rock is it's improvised. And so often you would think at any rate that the live albums by the jazz rock bands would be the ones to go for, because that's hearing them improvising in front of an audience. But actually, live jazz rock albums are a bit few and far between. It's hard to think of a classic jazz rock live album. If we think of jazz rock albums, we would say, you know, Weather Report, Heavy Weather, Birds of Fire, in the Chick Corea Romantic Warrior. You know, we start to pull. It's very, very few live albums that we can actually think of. So this album I wanted to really have a talk about on this video, and for some people who haven't heard it that like jazz rock, they can go and check it out and see if you agree with me. And the album is this one. Hope you can see it. I'll move back a little bit. Jeff Beck and Jan Hammer Group live, right? So This album comes from a tour which I think happened in 1976, and it was released in 1977. It was live. It was recorded live and remixed by Dennis Weinreich and Jan Hammer at Scorpio Sound Studios. Jan Hammer is an incredible engineer, producer, and mixer. He actually took over Wired by Jeff Beck and mixed it, and that's not credited. And I think the incredible sound on that album is down to Jan Hammer, who not only been an incredible keyboardist and composer, but also had a vision for a sound which I think suits jazz rock so well. The lineup on this is, of course, Jeff Beck, one of the greatest guitarists ever lived, on guitar. And then we have him playing with the Jan Hammer group, which would be Tony Smith on drums. And he actually does some singing on here. Tony Smith is one of my most influential drummers. This guy just flies. I came to know him in this group, the Jan Hammer group, and also John McLaughlin's One Truth band. What an incredible player. Another incredible player on bass, Fernando Saunders, one of the great jazz rock bass players from the 70s. We have the incredible Stephen Kindler on violin, who was one of the great violinists of the jazz rock period in the 70s, who originally came to the fore in the second version of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and then went on into this band where he did some incredible playing. And then in terms of jazz rock, sort of disappears. He's still around, and I have actually spoken to him very briefly on Facebook, and I would love to get him on the channel. But whether he wants to, I don't know. He's also playing a bit of keyboards. I actually was listening to this album this morning, and I thought, how is Jan Hammer playing all these keyboard parts at the beginning of Darkness? But I've just looked here, and it's actually Stephen Kindler. And that is the lineup. This is incredible. So let's give you some background to this album here. Shall we put it up? I will put it up here. Right, now as you can see as I stand up, I am dressed in all white today, in honor of all things Mahavishnu, because I felt I have not been catering for the jazz and jazz rock on this channel enough. So I thought I would wear all white and put the white light on and look like I am spiritual, so I can talk about this. But of course, the great split that happened in the Mahavishnu Orchestra with Jan Hammer and Jerry Goodman was over the fact that they weren't so spiritually inclined as John McLaughlin and Rick Laird. And that created a schism in the band. So in 1973, at the peak of their powers, Jan Hammer left the Mahavishnu Orchestra. Initially, he teamed up with Jerry Goodman, and he did an album called Like Children, which, if you're a Mahavishnu fan, is an essential album. He then decided to do a concept album called The First 7 Days, in which he plays virtually everything. It's like his version of Tubular Bells, based upon the story of Genesis, and that is also another classic jazz rock album. And then he forms what became known as the Jan Hammer Group and recorded one of the greatest jazz rock albums ever made, which is Oh Yeah. That was followed up by an album called Melodies, where the band ostensibly stopped playing jazz rock and wrote a load of songs. It is one of the greatest jazz rock albums ever made, and it brilliantly skirts between sort of commerciality, vocal hooks and all that area, and also jazz rock. And there's some incredible fiery playing on that album. It's one of my favorite albums of all time. There is a musician producer called Quantic, who had some success as Quantic, but also as the Quantic Soul Orchestra. And many years ago, Will Holland, which was the real name of Quantic, he was one of my students. When he came to me, he was really into punk rock and the Beastie Boys. And I introduced him to this album. And I do feel that this album, Melodies, was responsible for what Will Holland does today, which is this funky, Latin-esque dance music, or whatever you want to call it. He's a really incredible artist. And so I'd like to give some credit for the Jan Hammer Group, because if that influence is there, where else is it? A lot of people I know in the industry, especially people who are into dance music production, they rate Jan Hammer. You know, he is an icon, and rightly so. Now, Jeff Beck, of course, is one of the greatest rock guitarists of all time, emerging in that period in London where it was just producing incredibly influential guitarists. We're thinking of Jimmy Page, we're thinking of Peter Green, of course Jimi Hendrix, who was American but came over to London at that time, Richie Blackmore, and Jeff Beck. Now, I think of the sort of London 1960s produced guitarists. These are basically the guitarists. Oh, of course, Eric Clapton, sorry. These are the guitarists that create rock guitar. Probably the most out there and future thinking was Jeff Beck. And when he emerges in fact 66, 67 in the Yardbirds, he really is doing things on the guitar that in a way is equal to Hendrix and even a little bit beyond Hendrix, I think, in the actual guitar playing. He was never a writer, but he was a great player of melodies. He's one of the great guitarists that can play a melody. I would put him alongside Hank Marvin or who else? Dave Gilmour, Carlos Santana. You know, there's someone that isn't just there to show off and do loads of big fast guitar solos, but can actually play a tune because their sound is so signature. Jeff Beck has a signature sound, but actually his sound has evolved as he progressed. He is sadly missed by me and all of us, I think. And he's a giant in the music industry, a musician capable of selling out large gigs, which is interesting because after hearing the Mahavishnu Orchestra, more specifically John McLaughlin, back in 71, 72, he decided to make a move towards jazz rock, making the album Blow by Blow, which then became his biggest selling album. And Jeff Beck, although a multi-million selling artist, does not get the credit for being such a pioneer and for jazz rock and for being an artist that enabled jazz rock to be on the map in the 70s and the record companies funneled large amounts of money. When Blow by Blow came out, the record companies could see that, you know, they could make some money out of these instrumental jazz rock albums. So the story of the Mahavishnu Orchestra, John McLaughlin, Jan Hammer, and Jeff Beck is all intertwined. It's very interesting. When he came to record Wired, one of the greatest jazz rock albums of all time, he enlisted a couple of people from the jazz rock world that came in and really put their stamp on the album. The first being Narada Michael Walden, one of the greatest drummers of all time, who has played the Mahavishnu Orchestra, and also Jan Hammer, right? And Jan Hammer is all over Wired. And not only does he play keyboards on it, but he can contributes, I think, 3 compositions. And like I said, he was involved in the production. The production's down as being George Martin, but it's as much Jan Hammer. And it has that sound, a sound that Jan Hammer had pioneered in his Jan Hammer group, which is all based around his Moog synthesizer. In the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Jan Hammer was introduced to the Moog synthesizer because he wanted to be able to bend notes in the same way that John McLaughlin was doing. Not only to access the sort of expressiveness of a guitarist, but also to access the expressiveness in Indian classical music, i.e. get into the microtones and the bends, something that a keyboardist couldn't do. Jan Hammer's contribution to doing that is all-encompassing. And so if a keyboardist plays a keyboard solo or synthesizer solo now, they are going to have to try and avoid sounding like Jan Hammer because that sound is so everywhere. All right. And I believe that every type of music has loads of contributors to that music, but there's usually sound innovators within that. These are the ones who actually sound like the genre. They provide the sound. Charlie Parker was that for bebop, and I believe Jan Hammer was that for jazz rock and jazz fusion. I think the sound of his Moog combined with an electric violin is the signature sound of jazz rock. Okay, now all this I've explained because actually Jan Hammer, once he left the Mahavishnu Orchestra, with all the success they had, never seemed to have that much success with the Jan Hammer group. And so when we start talking about jazz rock, they get overlooked. I think that the Jan Hammer group was one of the greatest jazz rock bands of the 70s. And when I say one of the greatest, really were one of the greatest. And I think they surpassed Return to Forever. They surpassed even the Mahavishnu Orchestra at certain points in time. And I think that is down to the fact that Jan Hammer combined the sound of the Mahavishnu Orchestra but with a sort of secular street vibe. They're funkier, they're dirtier in a way. Now, I think the success of the Mahavishnu Orchestra was down to the fact that, you know, post-hippie sort of psychedelic types who wanted to have the ultimate experience in the gig and feel some sort of spiritual connection would go to a Mahavishnu Orchestra gig, you know, take some drugs and basically get pummeled for 3 hours and be pushed into this ecstatic state. I think once you take that away, it was harder for Jan Hammer to market this type of music. Now, going over to Jeff Beck, same thing happens. Jeff Beck's albums were so huge, and he was such a big and established artist, that he somehow does not get classed within the jazz rock realm. And this is always the case. You know, if you look up the lists of the biggest selling jazz albums of all time, Kenny G will not be on that list. He will never get mentioned. Now, you might hate Kenny G and you might love him, but he is playing jazz rock, jazz fusion. There's no two ways about it. But he'll get ignored. And I think that same thing happens to Jeff Beck. I've never seen him on these lists of the biggest selling jazz albums of all time. And this exposes a certain snobbery that exists within the jazz world. Jeff Beck is not from jazz. He didn't stop study bebop licks. But as we all know, in 1973, when Billy Cobham brought Tommy Bolin into his group, and he had a rock guitarist in the mix, that became an incredible, you know, vehicle for doing jazz rock. It was a genius decision by Billy Cobham to bring Tommy Bolin in. And I think that opened the doors for Jeff Beck. And I'm sure Jeff Beck was listening to Tommy Bolin. And of course, Tommy Bolin was influenced by Jeff Beck. You can see how all this is going around. You can see where I'm going to. So, in 1976-77, when jazz rock is at its peak, the Jan Hammer Group, one of the greatest jazz rock groups of all time, combines with Jeff Beck to create this live album. It's beautifully recorded. It's on a major label, and yet it doesn't even get mentioned in when we're talking about Jeff Beck. You know, even I tend to think, oh, you got Blow by Blow, then you've got Wired, and then in 1980 he did, you know, There and Back, another great jazz rock album. I need to hold it again. Where is it? Where is it? Now this album here, right? This album. Why do I think it's not that well known? Are you all right, Light? Right, so let's just go through the tracks on here. It opens up with Freeway Jam, which is a sort of funky shuffle, sort of well, it's inspired by Jack Johnson, that shuffle that opens up that John McLaughlin's doing. On Blow by Blow, it's a nice jam. On here, it's as fiery as can be. And towards the end of its 7-minute run, Jan Hammer just unleashes a tirade of incredible keyboard playing. It's peak Jan Hammer. Then we have Earth Is Still Our Only Home, which is a track off Like Children that Jerry Goodman, and again, it's a song, it's got vocals on it. This is one of the things about this album, I don't know why it wasn't successful, because we've got a jazz rock album, a full-on jazz rock album, but with vocals. And often when jazz rock musicians veer into that area, it's absolutely awful. But it's not the case with Jan Hammer. And they don't get singers in, they just let guys in the band sing on it. So on Earth Is, who's singing on Earth Is My Only Home? Yeah, that looks like it's Jan Hammer singing on that. Really rocking track. Then we have She's a Woman, which is quite a delicate sort of bouncy reggae-ish track off Blow by Blow. And then you get the full-on rocking fusion of Full Moon Boogie, which was off again Like Children. We flip it over and we get the full-on jazz rock. It opens up with Darkness, which starts with this incredible Oberheim string orchestra, which I've now found is being played by Stephen Kindler, combined with Jan Hammer creating all this spacey stuff, and then it slowly moves into full-on jazz rock. You could feel that Jeff Beck is standing in the background waiting to pounce. I think a few minutes go by before he unleashes, and then he comes in. And as he plays the melody line written by Jan Hammer, you could see how his guitar sound is so beautifully complemented by Jan Hammer's keyboard sound, and the guitar sound was a Freudian slip because that's what it sounds like. At this point, Jan Hammer was warning people that there was no guitar on this album, and I often wonder whether that was something that people didn't like, because a lot of the thing around the jazz rock groups, I haven't thought about this before, but a lot of the thing about the jazz rock groups was the fact that guitarists were listening to them because they were checking out the incredible stuff that John McLaughlin and Al Di Meola were doing. Weather Report struggled until they, brought in the disco influence, which is apparent on Heavy Weather, and that's not to knock Heavy Weather. That's a heavy album. So, Darkness in Search, Earth in Search of a Sun. This really is a long track, and the combination of Jeff Beck and Jan Hammer is far more complimentary than it is Jan Hammer and John McLaughlin. Oh my God, I'm saying sacrilegious things. Right, then after that we have Scatterbrain, and Scatterbrain is a track off Blow by Blow where Jeff Beck does his best to channel the Mavish Noctua. It's a furious track. And now we get to hear it with the actual man himself on keyboards, and it's it's just full on. This album's incredible. And then it closes with the classic Blue Wind, which is the Jan Hammer composition off Wired that Jeff Beck plays guitar on, and then Jan Hammer plays all the other instruments, including drums. I'm a big fan of Jan Hammer's drum playing. This is a classic album. Now, doing this channel, I've started to think that one of the reasons that albums don't become classics is down to their covers. I'm starting to spot so much that the cover of the album does influence people's perception of it. Now, I can remember going back to this album when I first bought it, because I actually wasn't this impressed when I bought this album, because I hadn't got to the Jan Hammer group at that point. I was just a huge Jeff Beck fan. And so I didn't quite get it. There was a lot of keyboard playing on it. There was tracks on here that I didn't know from the Jeff Beck albums. And so Jeff Beck's audience, it might be a bit of a leap to her to get a live album that didn't have tons of famous Jeff Beck's tracks, they could be thinking, well, where's Beck's Bolero and stuff like this? But the cover, I think, is pretty awful, right? It features a sort of blurry photograph of Jeff Beck playing live. There is no photographs of the Jan Hammer group. Now, of course, at this point in time, there had been Blow by Blow that had an incredible painting of Jeff Beck on the cover, and then Wired that has that amazing photo of Jeff Beck. It's so iconic. When I was a kid and I used to watch Jeff Beck, look at Jeff Beck on the album with the long hair and the sort of belt buckle and the white jacket. That is what I wanted to look like. He was the coolest thing. This doesn't really do it for me. It's a bit blurry and horrible with the horrible typeface over the top and the slanty writing. I do think this has an effect. And I've got to be honest, when I was a kid, what really upset me was that cut-out photograph where they couldn't even be asked to cut out the space between Jan Hammer and his keyboard, so we have this white blob. Right, so the cover doesn't sell the opulence of this album. And the focus on Jeff Beck, it has to happen really, but I think this should have been presented in a different way. Also, I think classic live albums tend to be double albums. Now, they must have recorded more material and they must have had more material when they played live. So it would have been great to have a double live album of this, and maybe that would have made a difference. It's very hard to think of single albums that are classic live albums unless that album has got original material on it. I'm thinking of Pictures of an Exhibition or the aforementioned Between Nothingness and Eternity. So there's problems with this album, but if you're a jazz rock fan, this is an essential album, and I wanted to give it some love on this channel. So go and check it out. It's absolutely brilliant. This is my original copy that I got on the sort of budget price. Originally on Epic. There's the album there. The other thing I wanted to do today is, it's been a long time since I've actually pulled an actual vinyl out, and I wanted to do that, so and go back to the old school. There's going to be no editing on this, right? It's just going to be raw Andy Edwards as he started out, you know. So that's my take on this album. Jan Hammer, of course, is interesting that after this, he put together another band to really explore a much more pop rock approach, and he made 2 albums called Black Sheep, and I think the next one's called Hammer. He had a group called Hammer. Hammer is one of the worst albums ever made. It's just absolutely awful. It's got terrible singing on, terrible production, and this really awful sort of attempt at, you know, AOR rock, I suppose, but with no guitars on it. He then teams up with Neil Schon and makes a couple of albums with Neil Schon that were actually very successful. So it's interesting that Jan Hammer often seems to need to have a guitar foil there. Of course, by the mid-80s, he was then chosen to do the soundtrack to the Miami Vice. And I can't think of any artist who has ever achieved that sense of success being a film or TV soundtrack composer as Jan Hammer, which it must have made him millions and set him up. And of course, here in the UK, the theme to my Miami Vice was a huge hit. And even Crockett's theme was a huge hit here. It's very interesting that that someone from that jazz world that then was a pioneer in jazz rock then went to achieve so much, you know, commercial success. And it mirrors Narada Michael Walden, the other great musician on Wired by Jeff Beck, that then went on to be a solo artist in his own right, winning all sorts of awards as a singer and songwriter, and then as a producer having some of the biggest hit records of all time. Now, what this shows is that what was going on in jazz rock in the 70s laid the groundworks for so much that was going on in black popular music in the 1980s. That's the through line of jazz rock. In much the same way as prog, that is the through line to British pop music. I'm thinking of groups like Frankie Goes to Hollywood and ABC and, you know, Depeche Mode. And so this lineage, which doesn't get talked about, is because of the snottiness that surrounds this genre. And I think that is my final comment on here, that this album coming out in 1977 was when the critics turned. Now, I've always thought they turned because these musicians were too sophisticated, it was too advanced, and it was beyond the average critic's musical ability, which usually means they are talking about the cultural impact of music rather than the actual musical impact, to be able to write stuff that made themselves look good in magazines in regard to prog and jazz rock. And also, I think the advent of disco threatened the jazz rock musicians, and I think they had a lot of ultimatums, especially those on major labels, to, you know, write a hit record or get lost. And so maybe this album just comes a little bit too late, I don't know. But it's good to go back and talk about it, go and check it out. And I think this is, I've got to the end of the video, haven't I? This is it. It's like one of my, these are proper old school videos when they used to be 15 minutes long. So if you like this video, stick a like on it. If you want to see some more videos, you press the subscribe button. I'm sure you all know how YouTube works, but I'm still going to patronize you by telling you how it works. I've got a Patreon. The Patreon is a big thing now. You know, there's tons of content up there. I'm putting content up, say, 3 or 4 times a week, including videos and all sorts of stuff. And it's different stuff to what I do here as well. We also have the Patreon meeting, which happens usually once a month, sometimes twice. And this week, I am actually including some of the chats we've had in the main videos here on YouTube. So my patrons are going to be contributing to stuff here. And in some cases, some quite controversial stuff. And also we have the Andy Edwards Patreon WhatsApp group, where my patrons can share music and talk about all this stuff. Because, of course, if you are a fan of this, who have you got to talk to it about? None of your family or friends like prog, do they? You're sat there, you know, well, they go on about Coldplay or how great Beyonce was on the TV, and you're sat there getting annoyed, you know, with your Van der Graaf Generator album or your 11th House album, and going, oh, I've got no one to talk about it. Well, there are people to talk about it. The thing is, you're going to have to join my Patreon to find them, but they're all there. So my Andy Edwards Club is there. If you are a very busy person and you can't waste the time, but you do want to support me here, I do have the PayPal tip jar. And the reason why you can see the light here is the light. The light is here. I bought that with the money for my PayPal tip jar, right? The better quality you'll see it. All of this has been provided by you, and I thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for the people who have contributed to me through my PayPal tip jar. I'm selling it at the end, as I always do. Please remember, I never do that at the beginning. I'm not like Rick Beato, where you get down, sit down to watch it, and you get 5 minutes in, and then he starts to tell you about his bloody Beato bundle. I ain't got no bundle, and I ain't going to tell you about it. But I do have a Patreon and a YouTube tip jar, so come on, support me here. This is what I do. This is what I'm doing for a living now. So, you've got to help me out. If these guys supported me hadn't come along, I don't know what I'd be doing now. Oh, I dread to think. It's hard times. We're having hard times at the moment. And so it's nice, when you got the world's problems, to be able to stick on a good, solid jazz rock album and be taken away by the brilliance of their virtuosity. I hope you like this video. I'm going to switch it off now. There'll be no editing, so you'll see my big white shirt as I fumble to find the button.